Cat has questions, curiosity, stories, and the strange corners of everyday life. Hello, hello. I'm Cat. Welcome back to Cat Has Questions. So, this week we're doing something a little different. It's still a true crime story, and there are absolutely real victims involved. But compared to some of the cases we cover here, this one's a little bit more fun. Because today we have an escaped prisoner, a secret apartment inside an abandoned Circuit City, and a grown man riding bicycles through Toys R Us after hours. An entire fake government career, a church romance, and one of the most unfortunately appropriate DVD choices ever discovered at a crime scene. So, we have a lot to talk about today. This is the story of Jeffrey Manchester, better known as the Roofman. In early 2005, a police officer walked through an abandoned Circuit City in Charlotte, North Carolina. And if you weren't around when Circuit Cities existed, how would you describe that? Like Best Buy, kind of? But like smaller scale and only technology? But in 2005, the store had been closed for months, and it was mostly empty. So Circuit Cities around this time were closing in 2005. But this particular store was mostly empty, but something inside didn't look right. The building still had electricity, and yet one particular section was strangely dark. The officer walked closer and noticed what appeared to be part of the wall. Except it wasn't. It was a door. A homemade door that had been painted to blend into its surroundings. And behind it was a room. A very small room. There was a bed, Spider-Man bedding, a Superman poster, Yoda figures, DVDs, a smoke detector, a fire extinguisher. Someone was living there. Police would eventually find a fingerprint inside, and when they ran it, they got a match. Jeffrey Manchester, a convicted armed robber who had escaped from prison 6 months earlier. And somehow, during those 6 months, Manchester had not only managed to avoid police, he had secretly lived inside a Toys R Us, moved into this abandoned Circuit City, joined a church, started going to Bible study, joined a gym, got some dental work done, made friends, and started dating a single mother of 3. Gave toys to her children. Toys R Us makes sense. And convinced everyone around him that his name was John Zorn and that he worked for the federal government. Which would already be enough material for an entire episode. Except that's not even why Jeffrey Manchester originally went to prison. Because before all of this, law enforcement agencies across the country had spent years trying to identify a mysterious man who kept breaking into McDonald's restaurants through the roof. And somehow, this story only gets weirder from here. So he would literally propel himself down into McDonald's. The hidden room and Manchester's double life were documented by investigators and later reporting. Manchester himself has also described this Toys R Us period in detail in a 2026 prison interview. So let's go back. Who is the Roofman? So for this, we're going back to 1998. Because at this point, nobody knows the name Jeffrey Manchester. Police just know that someone is robbing businesses in a very specific and extremely strange way. Usually the target is McDonald's, and the robber doesn't come through the front door. He doesn't smash a window. He doesn't wait in the parking lot for somebody to leave. He gets on the roof. He brings his power tools with him, his saws, drills, sometimes even an axe, which is a little terrifying, and cuts an opening roughly 2 feet by 2 feet. Then he lowers himself through the hole, sometimes dropping a pretty significant distance onto the floor below, and once inside, he waits, usually waiting for the opening employees to arrive. And just imagine this from their perspective for a second. It's 5 a.m, you're tired and you're opening McDonald's. The doors are locked when you arrive and you assume the building is empty and nothing seems weird. And then suddenly, a masked man with a gun appears from somewhere inside the restaurant. He orders the employees to open the safe and hand over the money. Then, when he's ready to leave, he usually puts everyone into the walk-in cooler. And then this is where the Roofman reputation started getting weird. Because victims kept describing him as polite. Extremely polite. He'd say please, he'd say thank you, he would apologize to them. According to accounts from the robberies, he sometimes told employees to get their jackets before locking them inside the cooler. Like he is being a gentleman about it. One victim remembered him repeatedly saying things like, essentially, "Would you please get on the floor?" Which is such a bizarre combination of words when they're literally being held at gunpoint. And sometimes he even reportedly joked with the victims. At least one investigator said Manchester sometimes told employees to look on the bright side because they probably would get the rest of the day off, which, like, fair. So, just not your typical robber. And after leaving, according to contemporary reporting, he sometimes called police himself so they would come and, like, let employees out of the cooler. So clearly he wasn't trying to, like, harm anybody. So the newspapers actually started coining him as the gentleman robber, the polite thief. One newspaper wrote that he had developed a coast-to-coast reputation as possibly the most courteous thief in America. And I do understand why that became part of the story. Because objectively, "Please put your coat on before I lock you in the freezer" is not typical armed robbery talk. But the polite reputation has also softened this story a lot over the years. Because Manchester was not harmless. Contemporary reporting says that during some robberies, he fired a semi-automatic handgun into walls to demonstrate that he was serious. He's also reportedly shot a telephone so employees couldn't call police. And during another robbery, he fired through a glass door while escaping. And in one Sacramento area McDonald's, an employee surprised Manchester and hit him in the head with a bucket. And Manchester responded by pistol whipping the employee. The employee wasn't seriously injured, but still, I just have to put it out there that, yes, it's kind of funny and harmless in a way, but like, I'm sure some of these people are still traumatized by being held up at gunpoint while at work. So pistol whipping someone, though, is a pretty significant footnote to the whole, quote, gentleman robber thing. Decades later, one of the North Carolina McDonald's managers who Manchester held at gunpoint still remembered the barrel of his weapon being pressed into her back. She also remembered worrying about a 78-year-old employee who worked there and what the stress of the robbery could do to her. When the Roofman movie came out, so they obviously made this story into a movie with Channing Tatum playing the main character. But that former manager told the Charlotte Observer very plainly, to her, this is a story about a bad guy. So I'm definitely going to be making fun of Jeffrey Manchester a lot in this episode because some of the things this man does are objectively ridiculous. But I'm not going to make fun of what happened to the employees. They didn't know Jeffrey Manchester considered himself a nice robber. They saw a man with a weapon. They had no idea what he was going to do, and that matters. But back in the late 1990s, police had a completely different problem. They couldn't catch him. So he was pretty much robbing for like 2 years. So from November of 1998 into 2000, the Roofman robberies started piling up. And he was everywhere. California, Oregon, Nevada, Minnesota, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, Massachusetts. By April of 2000, investigators had linked the mysterious robber to 38 robberies in 9 states. Later estimates would put his total above 40. Most involved McDonald's restaurants, although he did hit other businesses, including Burger King, Blockbuster, another throwback like Circuit City. This is certainly the 90s and early 2000s. Grocery stores, a home base, and, foreshadowing here, a Toys R Us. Police estimated that he had taken around $100,000, and investigators were starting to form a picture of the person they were chasing. He was athletic, very athletic, because dropping through a ceiling and hitting the floor without injuring yourself is apparently not something most people can do. Who knew? He was fast. He remained calm when things were wrong. He knew how to use weapons. He planned carefully. and investigators started wondering whether their guy might have military training. There were also some failed attempts. And these are my favorite part of the original spree, because Manchester was obviously very skilled at what he was doing, but he was still cutting random holes into buildings. And sometimes police found partially drilled holes where he had apparently abandoned the plan. He'd cut through roof and then discover that the thing directly underneath the hole, he couldn't get in there, like a freezer, for example. Which feels like information you probably would have wanted before completing the sawing portion of your evening. But possibly my favorite failed roofman robbery happened in Folsom, California. Manchester climbed onto a McDonald's, cut into the roof, made his entrance, and discovered the restaurant was closed because it was Thanksgiving. So for all of the surveillance, planning, cutting through ceiling, propelling yourself into it, apparently nobody told him to check for holiday hours. Police almost caught him another time in Placerville. Officers spotted Manchester after a robbery, and he took off running, crossed 4 lanes of highway traffic, and managed to disappear. And because these crimes were spread across multiple jurisdictions in multiple states, so he literally was from coast to coast, every time law enforcement thought they were getting close, he could simply just move somewhere else. One investigator essentially said, you set up surveillance in one city and he just drives down the road or to another state. By the spring of 2000, there was a $10,000 reward for information leading to his arrest. There were even copycats using his rooftop technique. And still nobody knew who he was. Until Manchester made a trip to North Carolina. So on May 20th, 2000, the roofman hit a McDonald's in Gastonia, North Carolina. It was 12:20 in the morning, same routine. Manchester cut a hole in the roof, dropped inside, pointed a gun at the manager, forced him to open the safe, put the employees into the walk-in cooler, and left with thousands of dollars. You might think that would be enough activity for one night, but Jeffrey did not agree with that. About 5 hours later, he targeted another McDonald's roughly 10 miles down the road, in Belmont. And this time, things did not go smoothly. Police responded, Manchester ran, and officers eventually found him hiding in tall grass. And reportedly, even when police finally captured him, Manchester remained extremely Manchester about it. He congratulated the officers on doing a good job. I'm sure that did not make them happy, but once he was in custody, investigators started comparing him with the mysterious roofman they had been chasing around the country. And everything lined up. His physical abilities, his movements, his access to transportation, weapons knowledge, his experience with heights. Because Jeffrey Manchester was not just some random guy with a Home Depot rewards account. So he's not just dabbling in this kind of stuff. He had military training. Manchester had grown up in California and enlisted in the U.S. Army. He served with the 82nd Airborne Division. He had training involving weapons and parachuting. He married when he was young and had 3 children. Eventually, he moved into the Army Reserve and worked in California. And Manchester later said he had a good job. He had enough money. And this is important because one explanation that gets repeated in some versions of this story is that he started robbing businesses because he wanted to give his children a better life. Manchester himself uses that explanation. But in his 2026 interview, he immediately undercut that. He basically said, yes, I wanted more for my kids, but I already had a good job. I was a sergeant. I was making plenty of money. I just wanted more. And you know what? I actually appreciate that distinction because it takes away some of the Robin Hood mythology here. This wasn't a starving father stealing bread to feed his kids. Manchester just liked the money. And apparently, eventually, he liked getting away with it too. His marriage actually began falling apart during this period. There had been a domestic disturbance at the family's military housing in 1999, and his wife ultimately filed for divorce and custody of their children. And some people like to say, oh, maybe the failing marriage is what caused him to kind of break and do all of this. But the Roofman robberies had already started before the divorce filings. So while the collapse of his personal life may have fueled what came later, it doesn't neatly explain why it started. Manchester was convicted over the North Carolina robberies and kidnapping charges connected with locking employees inside the cooler. Different reports summarize the original sentencing slightly different, but the bottom line was the same. He was going to prison for decades. Manchester was 28 years old, and his life as the roofman appeared to be over. And normally, this would be the point where I'd say he went to prison. The end. Except, if this story ended there, I probably wouldn't be doing an episode about it, even though the Spider-Man roofman repelling himself from McDonald's is an interesting story. But Jeffrey Manchester went to prison. He just didn't stay there. Manchester's arrest and later account of his motive are documented by reporting in his 2026 WBTV interview. Manchester eventually ended up at Brown Creek Correctional Institution in North Carolina. And for about 4 years, he was apparently a model inmate. He followed the rules, he worked. He earned enough trust to receive a job in the prison's metal plant. Which, I'm not really surprised by this, because if he's this gentleman robber, there's nothing to make me think he's going to be this, terrible inmate. But being put in the prison's metal plant, in hindsight, perhaps was not the ideal placement. Because while Manchester appeared to be settling into prison life, he was doing what Jeffrey Manchester does best. He was studying a system for weaknesses. In 2026, Manchester revealed something he said he had never publicly discussed before. Brown Creek was not the first prison he had thought about escaping. According to Manchester, at essentially every correctional facility where he had been housed, he had developed some kind of escape plan. He was constantly thinking, how would I get out of here? At Brown Creek, he finally found a plan he believed would work. Trucks moved in and out of the metal plant. Manchester had access to equipment because he worked there. He observed how the deliveries operated. And I think this guy legitimately thinks he's Spider-Man. He eventually created a hiding place underneath one of the trucks. Earlier reporting described a black painted platform and materials designed to conceal him if someone looked underneath the vehicle. So, on June 15th, 2004, Manchester crawled under an outgoing truck, positioned himself in the hiding spot, and rode out of the prison. That's it. That was the escape. He literally clung to the bottom of a truck like a squirrel and went out of prison. The man who had spent years entering businesses through places nobody expected left prison through a place nobody checked closely enough. He was free. Authorities initially thought Manchester might return to California because that's where his former wife and children were. His old life was there. In fact, he now says the months before he escaped, he had already figured out where he wanted to hide. He needed 3 things: food, water, shelter, and someplace police would never think to look for him. Manchester remembered taking his children to Toys R Us. He'd also robbed a couple Toys R Us's, if you recall, and decided that'll work. And I cannot emphasize enough that according to Jeffrey Manchester himself, the Toys R Us portion of this story was premeditated. This was not, oh no, I escaped from prison and where am I supposed to sleep tonight? He was allegedly sitting in prison thinking, you know where nobody looks for fugitives? Jeffrey the Giraffe's house. And annoyingly, he was right. Manchester escaped Brown Creek on June 15th, 2004, and said in an interview that he had planned both the escape and the Toys R Us hideout in advance. So, Manchester made his way to Charlotte. This Toys R Us that he chose was on Independence Boulevard. And once he got inside, by propelling through the ceiling, classic roofman, Manchester created a concealed living area. He had a small mattress, an inflatable chair, posters, toys, and obviously food wasn't difficult to find. Although his options were not exactly Michelin starred, he wasn't even at a grocery store. It was Toys R Us. And if you think about what Toys R Us has, it's candy and baby food. And that's pretty much what he survived on for a while. Also, can we talk about how this is every probably little kid's dream, that he's living in a Toys R Us, has toys and posters and all that. But on the flip side, think about how creepy that is, knowing if like these people like aren't taking their kids to a Toys R Us and there's literally a man hiding and sleeping there. But I think it's kind of karma that you successfully escape prison, but then your dinner is literally baby food. He also started opening merchandise. Manchester set up baby monitors around the store and like rigged it up so he could keep track of employees. He learned their routines. He watched who came in and out. He learned when different parts of the building were occupied. And he actually even reportedly gained access to scheduling information and may have been manipulating the employee's schedule to create opportunities for himself. So like when the store would close, he just would head on over to the computer, maybe cancel everybody's schedule so that nobody was coming in the morning or whatever, if he needed a little me time, I guess. But Toys R Us literally became Jeffrey Manchester's personal playground. He rode bicycles through the aisles. This is a grown-ass man. He played with toys. He exercised. Some accounts say he raced remote-controlled cars. There are even reports of him borrowing costumes from the store for entertainment, which, okay, that's scary if you think about if someone were to walk in and there's this grown-ass man wearing costumes. No, thank you. Just imagine, though, being an employee and finding out about this afterward. You spent your entire shift thinking the store was normal. Meanwhile, there's actually a fully grown escaped felon somewhere in the building wearing a costume, monitoring you through a baby monitor. No thanks. Manchester spent roughly his first month there, barely leaving the store. Then July 4th came around, and he decided to venture outside. So he took a bicycle, obviously from the Toys R Us, and he rode to a grocery store because he wanted a newspaper. While he was there, a stranger looked at him and said something along the lines of, "Do I know you?" And Manchester immediately panicked. He asked whether the man knew him from the military, and the man said no. Manchester decided that there was a very good chance this person had recognized him from news coverage about his escape, so he left. And then basically went back inside into hiding in the Toys R Us for another month. Eventually, Manchester found keys in the manager's office that gave him access to the roof, which completely changed things. Now he had outside space. He had a little indoor and outdoor space. He could go onto the roof at night. He could exercise. He could listen to music on his Sony Discman, another throwback. He could look at the Charlotte skyline and just think. Manchester later described the rooftop as his own private playground, that nobody could touch him there. But also, is not the Toys R Us his whole playground, not just the roof? You literally are living in a toy store. I have to imagine that after successfully escaping prison and spending months living undetected inside a major retail store, Jeffrey Manchester's confidence was becoming a problem. He was starting to feel untouchable, which, spoiler alert, is a recurring theme. But as the holidays approached, Toys R Us was about to become much busier, more employees, more customers, more inventory, more opportunities to get caught. Conveniently, immediately next door was an abandoned Circuit City. And of course, Manchester found a way to access it. And inside the vacant building, he created another hideout. So as I mentioned at the beginning, this Circuit City was a closed store, so people weren't coming in and out. There's nothing like that similar to the Toys R Us. He had to keep track of employees and all that, but the Circuit City was closed, so no one's really coming and going from there at all. But in the Circuit City, in this hideout, this is the room that police eventually discovered behind the homemade door. It was only around 4 feet by 10 feet, so it was a very small room. Manchester had painted the walls. He created a sleeping area. He decorated. There were Spider-Man sheets. Are you a 7-year-old boy? A Superman poster. So this guy clearly thinks he's like a superhero. Yoda figures, DVDs, a smoke detector, a fire extinguisher. Honestly, the smoke detector's kind of my favorite touch, because apparently Jeffrey Manchester thought, I have escaped prison. I am legally living inside an abandoned electronics store. I'm stealing stuff from a Toys R Us, but we're not going to be reckless about fire safety. We're pretty serious about that. His DVDs reportedly included Spider-Man 2, could have guessed that, Matchstick Men, 40 Days and 40 Nights, and Catch Me If You Can, which is almost offensively on the nose. And Catch Me If You Can, if you remember, that's that Leonardo DiCaprio movie where he is basically running around the world, breaking the law and doing things. Clearly Jeffrey Manchester wants to be this guy. You're not a Leo, brother. At this point, Jeffrey Manchester was successfully doing something that sounds impossible. But he had created another problem. He was lonely. Because being free doesn't feel especially free if you spend your entire life hiding behind children's bicycles. And he's literally an escapee from prison, let's not forget. So, it's not like he can just, go back to his wife and kids. He literally will just go back to jail. From his rooftop hideout, though, Manchester could see a church. Crossroads Presbyterian Church was nearby. Manchester had been raised Catholic, and according to him, he genuinely missed church. He liked being around people. He liked the feeling of everybody in a room focused on the same thing. But more importantly for a fugitive, he thought he could sit in the back, blend in, enjoy the service, leave without anybody noticing him. This plan lasted approximately one entrance. Manchester went through the wrong door. He got turned around inside the church. A woman noticed him, helped him find where he was going, sat with him, and started introducing him to people. His entire plan was to be anonymous. Instead, by the end of the morning, people knew him. Obviously, he couldn't say, "Hello, I'm Jeffrey Manchester. I live in Toys R Us in Circuit City." So he introduced himself as John Zorn. And John Zorn was a hit at this church. Manchester started attending church regularly. He joined Bible study. He became friends with Pastor Ron Smith. The pastor even invited him to Thanksgiving dinner. And in one of those details where reality is just being obnoxious, Manchester walked into the pastor's office and noticed movie posters on the wall. One of them, The Great Escape. Manchester later remembered seeing it and essentially thinking, well, that's a coincidence, which it sure was. All of this is almost too much to be a movie. I actually haven't watched the movie and I'm planning to watch it after I record this. I didn't really want it to taint me in what I was saying because I'd probably get confused about what's true and actually what's from the movie, but it's almost too much to be a movie, I think. So Jeffrey Manchester met a woman named Leigh Wainscott at the church. Lane was recently separated after a long marriage and was raising 3 children. She and Manchester started talking. She liked him. Obviously, people at the church liked him. The pastor liked him. Leigh later described him as funny, charming, polite, well-dressed, well-groomed, and extremely good at making people comfortable. There was nothing about him that screamed, "I escaped from prison underneath a truck." Manchester told Leigh that he had recently moved from New York and worked for the federal government. What did he do for the federal government? Classified, obviously, he can't tell you. Where did he live? That was pretty complicated too. Manchester claimed he lived in a secure government building, a sterile environment, visitors weren't permitted, which is an incredibly convenient job to invent when you reside in a Circuit City with Spider-Man sheets and a hole in the wall connecting you to a Toys R Us. But Leigh believed him. And that's not because she was stupid or gullible. Manchester had built social proof around him. He was at church, the pastor adored him, the congregation liked him, he showed up when he said he would, he was clean cut, he behaved normally. He had military experience, which explained little things like always wanting to face the door when they were in public. Nothing about the rest of his life looked like a fugitive. Eventually, he and Leigh began dating. They went on dates, they watched movies, he became involved with her children, and Manchester brought them presents, lots of toys. Wonder where he got those from. Around Christmas, he donated more toys to the church toy drive than anyone else. He gave Pastor Ron Smith DVDs, including seasons of Seinfeld. And again, it sounds really sweet until you remember that Manchester did not go shopping for these items. Toys R Us was essentially unknowingly sponsoring his entire social life. Manchester also joined a gym. He went to the dentist. I think also, I read somewhere that he actually got cavities when he was living at the Toys R Us from all the junk food, the candy and the baby food, not great on the teeth. He moved around Charlotte regularly. One police captain later said that If you drew a ring around the Circuit City, Manchester had probably spoken with everybody within a mile. At one point, Leigh teased him about not owning a car. So, Manchester went out and bought a 1999 Chrysler Concorde for about $5,000 in cash and put it in Leigh's name. Leigh's reaction was basically, wow, the federal government sure pays well. Manchester later said he tried not to tell more lies than necessary because too many lies become hard to remember. So his philosophy was to tell the truth about essentially everything, with 4 exceptions: his name, his job, where he lived, and the fact that he was an escaped prisoner. Those are kind of some 4 biggies, though. Manchester said his feelings for Leigh were real. He says he loved her. And for Leigh, the relationship was absolutely real. That's another part of this story that gets lost when everything is told like a comedy. Manchester knew who Leigh was, but Leigh did not know who Manchester was. She introduced this person into her children's lives based on information that wasn't true. So, while Jeffrey was playing John Zorn and thinking he had figured out how to live a normal life as a fugitive, Leigh was actually living that life, and she had no idea that it could collapse at any moment. By this point, Manchester also knew every day outside prison was borrowed time. But instead of making him more careful, it seemed to have made him more confident. He told WBTV that he once even had to go inside a police station for something, and no one looked twice at him. He blended in. And every time he got away with something like that, he became more convinced that he could continue getting away with everything. Eventually, that confidence took him right back to what had put him in prison in the first place: robbery. Manchester and Leigh's relationship has since been described independently by Leigh herself. Manchester wasn't just living inside the Toys R Us. He was studying it. According to Manchester, he successfully stole about $14,000 from the store at one point. Then he decided to do it again. December 26th, 2004, the day after Christmas, Manchester knew the store. He knew the employees, the exits, the schedules. He was literally making the schedules, so. And presumably, he knew that there was a lot of holiday money inside. Manchester went into the Toys R Us armed and attempted to gather the employees together. But 2 employees managed to run through a secondary exit, and the plan collapsed. Manchester ran. He escaped through another door that should have triggered an alarm, but he had already disabled it. Police arrived and began searching, and something wasn't adding up. Investigators could see employees leaving. They could review surveillance footage, but Manchester seemed to have disappeared. Police dogs reportedly found thousands of dollars in Toys R Us merchandise hidden above ceiling tiles. And suddenly, officers were looking much more carefully at the building and the properties around it. Still, they didn't immediately find Manchester's hideout in Circuit City. Manchester says his own mistake came when he went back for belongings that he had left behind. Specifically, photographs of his family. He later said they were the most important possessions he had. He believes an off-duty officer saw him or saw something suspicious, which led to another search. This time, police found the Circuit City room. Manchester thought he was safe. He said he had wiped down every inch of the hideout specifically to remove fingerprints. Except, according to his 2026 version of the story, he had been painting and accidentally left a thumbprint. Police recovered it, and it matched Jeffrey Manchester. Now, one detail that gets reported differently depends on the source. Several accounts say the identifying fingerprint was recovered from Manchester's copy of Catch Me If You Can. Manchester himself says the print was accidentally left while he was painting. I desperately want the Catch Me If You Can version to be true, because from a storytelling standpoint, it is perfection. But since the man whose thumb it allegedly was now tells a different story, we're just going to say police found a fingerprint. They knew Jeffrey Manchester had been living there. And yes, Catch Me If You Can was apparently among his movies. We're keeping in the fun part without lying. Once police identified Manchester, his face went onto the local news. And according to Manchester, the night his identity was broadcast on television, he was at Leigh's house. He had no idea. Someone from the church apparently recognized him, and authorities approached Leigh the next day. It was January 5th, 2005, her 40th birthday. Imagine getting ready to celebrate your birthday and police show up at your job. They show you a picture of your boyfriend and you say, "That's John." And they say, "No, that's Jeffrey Manchester. He's an escaped prisoner, committed armed robberies, and is considered dangerous." Although, according to Leigh, she initially thought the police had to be wrong. They showed her information online. The face was John. The name underneath wasn't. And when reality finally hit, Leigh fell apart. She cried. She later described it as feeling like someone had died. She was horrified, heartbroken, embarrassed. And probably the worst part, she immediately started thinking about her children. She had brought this man into their lives, and she had trusted him. Police now needed her help. They believed Manchester was getting ready to disappear, and they were right. Manchester says by then he had documents prepared, passports, driver's license, social security cards, everything he believed he needed to leave the country and start over again. But before he disappeared, he had two things he wanted to do. First, destroy evidence. Remember that dentist appointment because he had some little cavities? Manchester remembered it, and he knew dental x-rays had been taken. And somehow, the completely proportionate solution his brain arrived at was burn down the dentist's office. Before sunrise on January 5th, investigators say Manchester set fire to the office. Manchester now says this was one of the biggest regrets in that it was completely unnecessary. Yes, I would have to agree with that. Second, he wanted to see Leigh one final time. He loved her. He couldn't imagine disappearing without saying goodbye. And unfortunately for Manchester, Leigh had agreed to cooperate with the police. Leigh had already been planning to see Manchester for her birthday, so police told her, use that. Call him, act normal, tell him you're excited, confirm the plans, and Leigh did. She spent hours with the police. Her children were moved somewhere safe. She made calls to the man she had known as John while investigators listened. Manchester later said Leigh kept calling him every 30 minutes or so, which he admits was slightly unusual. And there was apparently a tiny part of his brain saying, this is weird. But then the rest of Jeffrey Manchester's brain said, she's probably just really excited for her birthday. Sir, you are an escaped prisoner. Police just found your hidden retail apartment. You should probably engage the suspicious portion of your brain. Manchester was driving toward Leigh's apartment when officers began following him. At one point, he suddenly made a U-turn, and police thought they had been spotted. But Manchester wasn't fleeing. He pulled into a grocery store, went inside, and came out carrying flowers. He had stopped to buy Leigh a bouquet. Manchester continued toward her apartment, and law enforcement were waiting. Leigh was nearby in the back of a police vehicle, listening as everything unfolded over the radio. Manchester got out, walked toward the apartment with the flowers, knocked, but there was no answer. He had a key, so he tried the door, and it wouldn't open. Something appeared to be blocking it from inside, and then Manchester heard vehicles behind him. A tactile team descended. Manchester was unarmed, and he surrendered. According to the Charlotte Observer, an officer asked him his name. Manchester said something essentially like, "You already know," but the officer wanted to hear him say it. And finally, the man Leigh knew as John answered Jeffrey Manchester. It was over. Leigh listened from the back of the police car and started crying. Later that night, she asked police whether she could speak with him, and they allowed a phone call. Both of them cried. Manchester apologized for deceiving her. Leigh apologized for helping police arrest him. And then she went home to deal with the aftermath of a situation she never knowingly signed up for. Police searched her apartment. The gifts Manchester had given her and her children became evidence. She barely slept. She stayed home from work for days. She felt humiliated and like everyone was judging her. Eventually, she stopped going to the church where she had met him. And here's a bizarre final detail from Leigh's side of the story. Remember the green Chrysler Manchester bought? Police had impounded it, and then eventually it was returned to Leigh. At some point afterward, the ventilation system started malfunctioning. She took the car to a mechanic. The mechanic opened everything up and discovered why the ventilation wasn't working correctly. There was a gun hidden inside. Apparently, police had missed it. Leigh drove the weapon straight back to the police station because at that point, I imagine her tolerance for Jeffrey Manchester-related surprises was completely gone. Manchester pleaded guilty to a long list of new crimes connected with the escape and Charlotte period. The charges include escape, robbery, breaking and entering, kidnapping, arson, and firearm offenses. He received an additional 25-year sentence that runs concurrently with his existing sentence. And just in case you're thinking, surely Jeffrey Manchester finally accepted that prison was unavoidable. No. He tried to escape again. Twice. One attempt came in 2009, another in 2017. Both failed. Manchester says the first resulted in about 2.5 years in solitary confinement, which sounds awful. The second eventually resulted in around 9 years in solitary. As of 2026, Manchester would like everyone to know that he is retired from escaping prison, which I am just thrilled to hear about. Congratulations on the retirement, Jeffrey. He remains incarcerated in North Carolina. His projected release is in 2036, when he will be in his mid-60s. And after spending decades, mostly known through police reports and newspaper articles, Manchester recently started talking publicly about what he did. In February 2026, WBTV released the first extensive interview where Manchester discussed the robberies, escape, and his time living in Toys R Us in his own words. And there's clearly a difference between the way Manchester talks about his crimes now and apparently viewed them at the time. During the robberies, Manchester says he convinced himself that what he was doing was essentially victimless. He wasn't stealing from the employees, he was stealing from a corporation. He believed he could control the situation and that nobody would get hurt. He now sees he can still picture the faces of the people he held up. He acknowledges that those people are absolutely victims. He hurt them emotionally. One of those victims, Elaine Snyder, has made it clear that even 25 years later, she does not share the more romanticized views of Manchester that have developed around this story. And I think that's worth hearing, because Jeffrey Manchester has become a very easy person to turn into a character. He's charismatic, clever, his crimes are weird, and his escape is almost cinematic. His secret Toys R Us life sounds like something a screenwriter would pitch and be told was too unrealistic. And like I said, Hollywood literally made a movie about it. Roofman was released in October 2025 with Channing Tatum playing Manchester and Kirsten Dunst playing a fictionalized version of Leigh. The real Leigh has since spoken publicly about what happened. Interestingly, after years without contact, she and Manchester have reconnected as friends. She's visited him in prison, and they do speak occasionally. She's remarried and has been very clear that it is not a romantic relationship. She says she believes Manchester is remorseful and that she has forgiven him. Manchester says he doesn't blame her for helping police capture him. He says she had every right to do what she did. He betrayed her trust. And ultimately, Manchester now puts responsibility for where he is squarely on himself. He has said there was no gang forcing him, no drug addiction, no peer pressure. He made all of these decisions. And one of the more interesting things he said in the 2026 interview was that, at the time, he had become convinced he was simply too smart to be caught. He planned everything, he saw weaknesses where other people didn't see, and then success reinforced that belief. Every police officer he escaped, every day inside Toys R Us, every time he walked around Charlotte and nobody recognized him, every church service, every date, every time John Zorn successfully existed while Jeffrey Manchester was on the run, it made him more confident, until confidence became arrogance, and arrogance made him sloppy. Manchester himself summed it up very simply. He deserved to get caught. And that is Jeffrey Manchester, the Roofman. A man who robbed dozens of McDonald's restaurants by cutting through the ceiling, got caught, escaped prison under a truck, moved into a Toys R Us, survived on baby food and candy, rode bikes through the store at night like a 7-year-old, built a secret Circuit City apartment that apparently he painted the walls of, joined a church under a fake identity, got a girlfriend, invented a federal government career, burned down his dentist's office, or at least attempted, and ultimately got caught because he couldn't resist going back to see the woman he had fallen in love with flowers. There are plenty of criminals where you finish researching and think, this person was a criminal mastermind. And there are others where you think, this person is a total idiot. Jeffrey Manchester somehow manages to make a very strong case for both. Because hiding inside a Toys R Us for months without anyone finding you? Impressive. Robbing the Toys R Us that you are currently secretly living in? Less impressive. And cutting through the roof of a McDonald's only to discover that it's Thanksgiving and the McDonald's is closed. That one's gonna stay with me forever. That one's gonna stick around. So I do have questions. First of all, if you had to secretly live inside one early 2000s retail store for 6 months, which one are you picking? Because now that I think about it, Toys R Us would actually be pretty high on the list. Target would obviously be number one, because you don't have to at least secretly eat baby food at Target. They have an entire grocery section, they've got clothes, they've got it all. And second, where do you land on Jeffrey Manchester? Do you think the charm and weirdness of the story causes people to minimize what he actually did? Or can both things be true? That he caused real harm, and this is one of the most unbelievable true crime stories ever. Let me know what you think. You can find me on Instagram, TikTok, email me. And as always, if you have a case, mystery, or apparently fully grown men secretly living above your local retail establishment that you think I need to look into, send it my way. Stay curious. Thanks for listening to Cat Has Questions. If you liked this episode, follow the show and share it with someone who loves a good spiral. See you next week.